So my wife, in addition to picking this black fuzz out of my beard that I had sitting there, she also reminded me that next weekend is the time change for daylight saving time. And so I just remind you to Saturday night, set your clocks back 1 hour, but if you forget, no big deal, you can be here early. So, prayers at 7:30, Sunday school is at 8:30. We invite you to join us. It's always a good time. So, but no worries if you forget. We'd love to have you. So as many of you know, my wife and I lived in Marshall, Minnesota before coming here. And one thing that happened in Marshall while we were living there that I was always happy about was that a Taco Bell opened. It was kind of a nice thing. And I actually took credit for the Taco Bell opening because my aunt works for a company called Borders Foods, which is a franchisee of Taco Bell, and they actually operate most of the Taco Bells in this area of the country. And she helps train new managers and stuff. And I mentioned to her one time, we don't have a Taco Bell in Marshall, and she's like, I'll write that down. 2 years later, we had a Taco Bell. I don't know if those two events were related or not, but I'm claiming it. We got a Taco Bell. But one thing that's interesting about Taco Bell that I've noticed is that no matter what Taco Bell you go to, they always serve Pepsi products. Always. Always. It's always, you will never go to a Taco Bell and not see Pepsi there. It's just the way that it is. And it's not only Taco Bell, but also Kentucky Fried Chicken and Pizza Hut. They will exclusively serve Pepsi products. And why is that? What is the reason that Taco Bell and KFC and Pizza Hut only serve Pepsi? And the reason is actually kind of interesting, and it's actually relevant to what we're going to be talking about today. So the reason that Taco Bell, KFC, and Pizza Hut all serve Pepsi is that these three restaurants are owned by the same company. They're owned by a company called Yum Brands, Yum ! Brands. So they're owned by this company called Yum Brands. And Yum Brands is owned by a company called PepsiCo. Sounds familiar, because PepsiCo is the parent company to Pepsi. And so the reason that Taco Bell, KFC, and Pizza Hut all serve exclusively Pepsi products is because they're owned by the same company that produces Pepsi. And it would be silly for a company to support their competition. So that's why they do that. And it's interesting that this kind of brand relationship where one brand is owned by another brand or owned by another company that owns a bunch of other brands, this isn't something that's unheard of. It's actually a very common thing in the world we live in today. It's the norm, actually. It's normal. When we go grocery shopping, most of the brands that we buy are owned by one of 11 companies. So when you go to the store and you're buying a bunch of stuff, you're almost exclusively supporting one of these 11 companies. If I go to the store and buy Purina dog food and Gerber baby food and a Jack's Pizza, I'm buying stuff that was all produced by Nestle, same people that make the chocolate chips, right? It's all one company. And if I buy, say, Captain Crunch and a box of Rice-A-Roni and some Ruffles potato chips, I'm buying stuff made by the same company that owns Taco Bell, by PepsiCo. It's all connected and all related. Now, the point that I have in pointing this out, the reason I'm saying this, so the last 6 weeks that I've preached, the last 6 sermons I've preached, or the last 5 sermons plus this one that I've preached have all been about, they've all been a part of our Gods at War series. Like, we've talked about these idols in our lives that are warring for control of our heart. These things that we allow to take the place of God in our lives. And, we've talked about things like the false god of pleasure, of love, of success, of power and money. And we've talked about how these idols creep into our lives and dethrone God from our hearts. But the thing is that these idols that we've been talking about are all connected to another idol. They're all, in a lot of ways, they're subsidiaries of another idol. And that idol is the idol we're talking about today. Today, we're going to be talking about the false god of ourselves, or the false god of me. And we're going to talk about this by going to one of the most unique chapters in the Bible. And we're actually going to spend the entire time here, so if you have your Bible, you can open it, and I'm not going to be going to a whole bunch of other places. We're going to be staying in Daniel chapter 4 today. Now, Daniel chapter 4 is unique because it was written by a king that had a reputation as an evil, pagan monarch. His name was King Nebuchadnezzar, and he was the king of Babylon, which at the time that this was written was the most powerful empire in the world. Babylon was the most powerful city in the world. And Jeremiah 39 tells us a little bit about Nebuchadnezzar. It says that Nebuchadnezzar murdered the sons of one of the kings of Judah right in front of him. So he captured Judah, took the king, took all the king's sons, killed the king's sons while the king was watching him, and then gouged out the king's eyes, so that the last memory the king would have of what he saw would be the murder of his children. This is King Nebuchadnezzar. This is, he also had other rulers of Judah literally roasted alive, roasted to death over a fire. Like, Nebuchadnezzar's power and cruelty had no equal. But he wrote Daniel chapter 4. He wrote a chapter in the Bible. And not only is it fairly surprising that he would write a chapter of the Bible, but what he writes is shocking, especially when you compare what he writes to the things that he had done. Now, Daniel 4 starts out, verses 1 through 3, saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to the nations and people of every language who live in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. So this is what King Nebuchadnezzar wrote. Now remember, this is the king who conquered the land of God's people, literally roasted their rulers over fire, killed the king's sons in front of him and gouged out his eyes, so that would be the last thing that he would see. This man then writes about God in this way. Nebuchadnezzar had basically written a worship song to God. And with all that we know about him, he really seems like the last person on earth that would be singing praises to God. And it would honestly be like North Korea's dictator holding a revival meeting and preaching at it. And it's just like we can't wrap our minds around how weird it is that King Nebuchadnezzar is writing a chapter of the Bible. So how did it happen? How is it that Nebuchadnezzar is praising God? Now, this particular chapter of Daniel chapter 4 uses a literary device that's actually fairly common today. It's called reverse chronology, where, and you've no doubt seen it in movies or read in the novels, where it starts with an event happening, a big event happening, right? And then the story goes backwards, and then we get the story that leads up to that event. It begins to explain what led up to that event. And that's what's happening here. What Nebuchadnezzar is doing here is he's explaining that something big happened. And then as he goes through the rest of what he's writing, we're going to see the events that led up to this big thing happening. And we see this incredible change in Nebuchadnezzar's life, where he went from roasting the kings of Judah to praising their God, we see this huge change where he goes from being the ultimate self-worshiper to worshiping the one true God. And so this is how this happens. Starting in verse 4. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace. I saw a dream that made me afraid. As I lay in bed, the fancies and the visions of my head alarmed me. So now notice how things are for him. He's at ease and he's prosperous. Things are good. And in a little bit, we'll actually see how prosperous he was. There will be an explanation of it. But really, he was at the pinnacle of his success as a ruler. He was the king in the most powerful city in the world over the most powerful empire the world had never, ever known up to that point. He was at the pinnacle. He was living the good life, but then he has a nightmare. And as we continue reading, we're going to see that he dreams of an enormous tree that is visible to the ends of the earth, an enormous tree that is full of fruit and provides shelter and food for every creature on the earth. And that's what happens kind of after verse 5 there. We see this he explains this dream. But then we get to verse 13 and we see him recount this. I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said thus, chop down the tree and lop off its branches, strip off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds from its branches. So Nebuchadnezzar has this dream of a huge tree. But then this messenger comes from heaven and says, cut it down, rip off its leaves, scatter all the animals that live under it. But that wasn't all that happened that really scared him as we continue on. But leave the stump and its roots in the earth, bound it with a band of iron and bronze amid the tender grass of the field. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the beasts of the grass of the earth. So that this stump was to be bound and left in the field where the animals could keep it company and it could be drenched with dew. But then the angel continues. Let his mind be changed from a man's and let a beast's mind be given to him. Let 7 periods of time pass over him. The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will and sets over it the lowliest of men. So the angel says, one of the things that we need to point out here, the angel says, let his mind be changed. And so there's this dream of a huge tree visible from all the way from the ends of the earth, and it shelters and protects and provides for all these living creatures. And then this angel shows up and says, chop it down, get rid of it, scatter its fruit, make the creatures flee, but leave the stump. Leave the stump and let the dew of the earth and all these things happen to it. So we see that this tree isn't just some inanimate object. The tree represents a person. And I think that's probably why this dream scared Nebuchadnezzar so much, is because he had this dream and he knew that it represented somebody, a person whose splendor is seen throughout the whole world, a person who provides food and shelter for many. And this person is going to be cut off. He will lose his mind so that he is like an animal. And all this is going to happen so that everyone will know that God is the true ruler of all the kingdoms of the earth, and he chooses who reigns. He chooses who's in charge. And so this dream scared Nebuchadnezzar. It worried him. And so he asked Daniel to interpret his dream, because he knew that Daniel was connected to the Most High God and that the Most High God spoke through Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar knew that, and so he trusted Daniel, and he asked Daniel to interpret his dream, and Daniel is noticeably upset. It says that he wishes that the interpretation of the dream was for the king's enemies. But then Daniel says, It is you, O king. It is you, O king. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream about himself. Now, Babylon was the largest city in the world at the time. There was no one more powerful than King Nebuchadnezzar. He was the tree, and he was going to be cut down. Daniel continued in verse 25. You shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of the heaven, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. God is going to give this king who thinks he's a god a reality check. God is going to make it clear that there is only one God, and it's not Nebuchadnezzar. But we're going to kind of take a pause from the story here, and we're going to do a little self-diagnosis. We're going to look at some things. We're going to ask some questions of ourselves. And really, these are some questions that we can ask ourselves as we look at Nebuchadnezzar's life that will help us determine if we're sitting on the throne of our own lives like King Nebuchadnezzar was. It will really help us understand if the gods that we follow are really just another way for us to put ourselves on the throne of our own lives. Now, the first question that we get to ask is, what motivates you? What is your motivation? Now, for King Nebuchadnezzar, he was motivated to impress others. Now, in Daniel chapter 3, earlier in Daniel, we read about him building a huge statue and insisting that everyone in his kingdom bow down and worship it or be put to death. Right? This is some of the things Nebuchadnezzar done. He was consumed with everyone acknowledging him and his importance. That was his motivation. In a lot of ways, he was kind of seeking this God of love that we talked about a few weeks ago, where just everyone is accepting of him and that he feels loved by the people. But really, this God of love that he was following was actually the God of himself. It was for him. Now, the second question we can ask is, what is your standard of success? For Nebuchadnezzar, it was personal gain. We look through the history books, and we see that the king's main palace was some 350 yards long. That's huge. 3.5 football fields in length. And today, we might be amazed at a home that might have 10 or 12,000 square feet. We might think that is a huge house. But King Nebuchadnezzar's palace was estimated to be about 630,000 feet. 630,000 feet. That's 6 times the square footage of our building. Our building is about 60,000 square feet. So think about it. That's 10 times the size of our building here. 10 of our buildings lined up one after another. That was his house. It's huge. He was seeking success and personal gain. But the God of success in his life was really about his success. It was about him. He was chasing the God of me by chasing success. Now, the third question we can ask is, what is your source of power? Where do you go to find help? Where does your help come from? When you need strength, where do you find it? For Nebuchadnezzar, it was self-empowerment. Now, in verse 29, the king looks at all of his success and concludes that it was accomplished by his mighty power. He says, at the end of 12 months, he was walking on his roof in the royal palace of Babylon, and the king answered and said, is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty? His power and his accomplishments were all about him. The God of success in Nebuchadnezzar's life was the God of himself. The God of power in Nebuchadnezzar's life was the God of himself. And the fourth question that we can ask is, what is the purpose of your life? Now, for King Nebuchadnezzar, it was personal happiness. Everything he did, every single thing he did, was motivated by a desire to be happy and satisfy. The God of pleasure that he was chasing in his life was the God of himself, the God of me. Everything Nebuchadnezzar did, everything was about serving himself. And how Nebuchadnezzar answered these questions are really, in a lot of ways, the same answers we give when we are serving the God of ourselves, when we are worshiping the God of me. But we're about to see that God was ready to flick Nebuchadnezzar off that throne of his own heart, that God was about ready to show Nebuchadnezzar who God really is. Now, Daniel tells the king that he's about ready to be cut down, that Nebuchadnezzar will soon be living like an animal and eating grass. And in verse 27, Daniel actually gives Nebuchadnezzar some advice. He says, "Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may be perhaps a lengthening of your prosperity." Daniel tried to warn the king. He's like, look, God doesn't like what you're doing. And if you continue to do it, then God is going to show you that he is truly the God and you're not. But one of the problems of making ourselves God is that we don't always tend to take advice very well. Like when we're pretty sure that we're right, we don't like listening to other people when they tell us we're wrong. And King Nebuchadnezzar was the same. And we see in Daniel 28, or 4:28, all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar, that he was a year later, he was on the roof of his palace, and he said, "Look what I have done. Look at the greatness that I have built by my power, by my majesty." And it had been a year since he had this dream. Maybe he had forgotten about it. Maybe he just didn't really care. But he was walking around thinking to himself, look how awesome I am. I'm the man. And look at all the great things I have done. But then we read, verse 31, while the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men. And your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like an ox. 7 periods of time shall pass over you until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will." And that's exactly what happened. Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with dew of heaven till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird claws. Nebuchadnezzar had worshipped and served himself. He was the God of his own life. So God took everything from him, even his mind. God took that away from him. Now, just try to imagine the transformation that took place. Most powerful man in the world, and all of a sudden, he can't live with people anymore. He lives outside in the fields with grazing animals, slept in an open field, woke up in the morning covered in dew. His hair had become matted and coarse and looked like eagle's feathers. His fingernails were like claws because they were so long and never cut. And this went on for 7 years. So you think about like middle school and high school, and a year after that. 7 years of time that Nebuchadnezzar was like this. But then something changes. At the end of those days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" So this man, who thought he was God, is made a beast, so that he can eventually realize that he is just a man. And if we skip down to verse 37, we read this. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. Nebuchadnezzar had learned his lesson, and in the process of learning that lesson, he took himself off the throne of his own heart, because he knew that there was only one God, and that what God was not Nebuchadnezzar. The most powerful man in the world realized he is just a man. And now he answers those 4 questions differently. He says, when God replaces us on the throne of our lives, we'll answer these questions differently as well. Instead of being motivated to impress others, we're motivated to please God. Instead of personal gain being our standard of success, our standard becomes faithfulness to God. Instead of being self-empowered, we realize how dependent we are on God and God's power in our lives. And instead of pursuing our own personal happiness, our purpose becomes seeking God's glory. Now, the big problem with making ourselves God is that we can't save ourselves. We can't make ourselves better. We can't make the things that we deal with better. Did you catch what Nebuchadnezzar did in verse 34 when he finally changed? At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven. When King Nebuchadnezzar took himself off the throne and placed God there, he was restored. When he realized that when the king realized that he was created to serve God instead of have the whole world serve him, he was saved. When we put God on the throne instead of ourselves, we too are saved. We all deal with hard things, and hard things happen to all of us, and it's the world we live in. We can't save ourselves from that. But when we place God on the throne of our lives, he leads us through that. He carries us through that. No matter what false god we are serving, it all boils down to the fact that we are serving ourselves. And when we are on the throne of our lives get out of whack. And we make it infinitely harder to deal with the troubles that this world brings. But when God is on the throne, when he is in charge, he leads us through those troubles. He gives us hope and purpose in the midst of the struggle. And he allows us to find joy in the midst of the strongest storm. So who is on the throne of your heart? Is it you? Or is it the God who created you? Ask yourself these 4 questions. I lost it there, but ask yourself those 4 questions. What motivates you? What is your standard for success? What is your source of power? What is the purpose of your life? And if you find that God isn't the answer to any of them, then ask God to return to his throne and to restore you. Ask him to save you from yourself. Now we're going to have one more song as we finish our service today. And I just encourage you to take this time to seek God, to ask yourself those questions, and just to ask God to come back into the throne of your heart, to reveal to you the things that you've placed in his position so that you can move those things out of the way. Take this time to put God back into his proper place. Hello, I'm Rich England, the pastor here at River of Life Community Fellowship, and I want to thank you for joining us for our online service today. Here at River of Life, we hope and pray that you've been blessed and encouraged by what God had to say today. If you'd like to know more about our church, we invite you to find us online at www.rolfellowship.com or on social media. We're on both Facebook and Instagram. Just search at ROL Fellowship. Thank you, and God bless.